The 92nd floor of Williams Tower cut through the Manhattan skyline like a blade of glass and steel, catching the late winter light in hard, cold shards. Inside, behind floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched from one end of the penthouse to the other, Richard Williams stood motionless. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, tall, immaculate in a charcoal suit, every detail precise and lifeless. From this height, New York looked like another world. Yellow cabs swarmed like insects far below. The Hudson shimmered in the fading sun. Music was spilling from a street corner saxophone somewhere, though it would never reach him here. The city moved, breathed, laughed, and fought. But not Richard. Not anymore. At 34, he had everything most people only dared to dream of: a net worth climbing toward $11 billion, the kind of power that could tilt markets, and a reputation as the man who never lost a negotiation. They called him the Ice King of Manhattan, and he did nothing to correct them. The name was accurate. 16 years earlier, the crash had taken it all: Hannah's laughter, the warmth in his chest when she entered a room, even his ability to have children. The doctors had spoken clinically without emotion, but the message had been clear: the family he once imagined would never exist. And in the silent aftermath, Richard had locked every shred of feeling behind iron walls. His penthouse reflected that choice. Polished marble floors, monochrome art, glass and chrome surfaces are so flawless that they seem untouched by human hands. A space designed for appearances, not living. Even the air felt colder than the streets below. That morning had been like any other: markets opening, emails flooding, and phone calls from partners who addressed him with equal admiration and fear. Yet beneath the rhythm of profit and power, a restlessness stirred, subtle but persistent. He ignored it the way he ignored everything that didn't fit into his carefully curated existence. Until Magnolia's voice broke through the intercom. Mr. Williams, his chief of staff, said, each syllable precise, that the new live-in housekeeper had arrived for her interview. Richard didn't turn from the glass. "Have human resources handle it." She reminded him that you asked to approve all residential hires after, personally, the last incident. He exhaled slowly, remembering the betrayal photographs of his private rooms, sold to tabloid strangers on the internet, dissecting the contents of his home. His sanctuary had been violated once. It wouldn't happen again. 5 minutes, he said finally. The conference suite on the executive floor was as stark as the rest of the building: steel glass, the faint scent of fresh polish. He expected a resume full of references, a cautious smile, a practiced deference. But when the door opened, time seemed to slow. She was nothing like he'd pictured. Nancy Martin stood with perfect posture, wearing a simple navy dress that had been cared for, if not new. Her dark skin caught the light in warm undertones. Her hair, in a smooth twist at the back of her head, revealed the graceful line of her neck. And when she looked up at him, her eyes, deep, luminous, unafraid, met his without hesitation. Richard's pulse gave a single sharp jolt. He told himself it was nothing. Biology. Reflex. But her gaze lingered steady, as if she saw the man, not the fortress. "Mr. Williams," she said, extending her hand. Her voice carried traces of the South, each word soft but certain. Her handshake was warm and firm, honest. No trembling, no coyness. With a flicker of something dangerously close to curiosity, he realized that she wasn't intimidated by him at all. Perhaps that was why he didn't immediately let go of her hand. In the weeks and months to come, Richard would tell himself he had hired her because she was the most qualified candidate, her references were impeccable, and she understood the value of discretion. But standing there in the sterile conference room, her calm composure breaking through the airless formality like sunlight through glass, he already knew the truth. Something had shifted. And for the first time in 16 years, Richard Williams felt the ice's faintest, most dangerous crack. If you've ever believed that the most unexpected encounters can change the course of a life, stay with me. You might see how a single moment, a handshake, a look can melt even the coldest heart. And if this glimpse into Richard and Nancy's world stirs something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments and follow along, because this is only the beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The day Nancy Martin officially moved into Williams Tower was one of those brittle Manhattan mornings where the cold felt almost metallic against the skin. The city below was a mosaic of motion, steam curling from subway grates, bundled figures hurrying through wind tunnels between skyscrapers, yellow cabs scattering like restless bees. Inside the penthouse was a world apart. The elevator doors slid open into a private foyer, polished to such perfection that Nancy's reflection shimmered in the marble floor. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her single worn leather suitcase. It was the only one she'd brought, though it carried more than clothes. It carried every chapter of her life she had no intention of reopening. Richard was not there to greet her. A silent, middle-aged woman from his staff led Nancy through the penthouse, her heels clicking softly on the marble. The air was scented faintly with bergamot and something sharper, clean, deliberate, masculine. Every line of the space was straight, every object in its place. No photographs, no traces of history, just beauty stripped of intimacy. The tour was efficient. The staff wing, the laundry area, and the service elevator. When they reached the guest quarters, Nancy would occupy. The woman handed her a minor silver key. "Mr. Williams values discretion," she said, her tone carrying both a warning and an expectation. Nancy thanked her and waited until the door shut before letting out a quiet breath. She placed her suitcase on the bed, immaculate white linen crisp as untouched snow, and walked to the window. From here, Manhattan sprawled in every direction, the winter light washing it in pale gold. It was beautiful, but distant, as though the glass between her and the city was more than just physical. Later that morning, Richard appeared. She heard the sound of his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him, precise, unhurried, the rhythm of a man who had never needed to rush for anyone. He stopped in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes assessing her with the cool detachment of someone examining an investment. "Ms. Martin," he said, his voice deep, smooth, and measured. "I trust the accommodations are acceptable." "They are," she replied, matching his calm. "Thank you." Something flickered in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, or surprise. She had spoken without the tentative deference he seemed to expect. He studied her for a moment longer. "Magnolia will give you a complete list of duties. I prefer order, privacy, and no unnecessary noise." Nancy inclined her head. "I prefer clarity. That makes two of us." For a fraction of a second, something warmer than ice touched his expression, a ghost of a smile that didn't quite form. Then it was gone. In the days that followed, Nancy learned the rhythms of the penthouse. Richard's world was built on precision: breakfast at 7:15, coffee black and unadulterated, his desk arranged to geometric perfection. She learned to move like a shadow, present, efficient, but never intrusive. Yet occasionally, she would catch his eyes on her, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't meant to start. And she, in turn, noticed things others might miss: the way his fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly, when a news segment mentioned a car accident. The long pauses he took at the window after specific phone calls. The untouched piano in the corner of the living room, its lacquer gleaming under a film of dust. One evening, a sudden snowstorm rolled over the city. The wind howled against the glass, and the skyline's lights blurred into watercolor smudges through the falling white. When Richard entered, Nancy was in the kitchen wiping down the counters. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disordered, as though the storm had followed him inside. "Coffee?" she asked. Glancing at the clock, it was late for him. "Please." His voice was quieter than usual. The edge smoothed away. She poured it into a porcelain cup and set it before him. For a moment, he didn't touch it. Instead, he watched the snow outside his profile carved in shadow. "Do you like it here?" he asked suddenly, still looking at the glass. She considered the question. "It's different," she said. "Quiet. But quiet can be good. It gives you space to hear your thoughts." He turned his head toward her, then something unreadable in his eyes. "And what do you hear?" Nancy met his gaze steadily. "That depends on whether I'm ready to listen." The air between them held for a moment, charged with something unspoken. Then Richard lifted the cup, took a sip, and looked back toward the city, as if retreating to safer ground. Nancy returned to work, but her heartbeat felt slightly louder in the silence. She could sense it beneath the layers of discipline and detachment. The man wasn't made entirely of ice. There was something else buried deep, waiting for the right moment to surface. And though she didn't know why, she felt sure she would be there to see it. The blizzard had passed, leaving Manhattan wrapped in a hushed whiteness. By night's time, the city's usual pulse had slowed to a muted rhythm. Snow piled on rooftops, streets muffled under drifts, and a pale moon casting silver shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Williams penthouse. Nancy had retired early to her quarters. She'd grown accustomed to the stillness of the building after hours, the way the hum of the city faded into a kind of velvet silence. She was half asleep when it happened, the sound that tore through the quiet like glass shattering. A sharp, ragged cry. It was followed by another lower, but laced with the kind of pain that didn't belong to the waking world. She sat upright, listening. It came from the far end of the corridor behind the double doors she had been told to leave undisturbed Richard's bedroom. For a moment, she hesitated. Every rule Magnolia had given her had been clear privacy. But another sound came, a hoarse murmur that cracked mid-word, and that decided it. She slipped into a robe and padded down the corridor, her bare feet silent against the carpet. The door wasn't locked. She pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The room was dim, lit only by the faint spill of moonlight across the bed. Richard was tangled in the sheets, his chest heaving, his face twisted as if in the grip of some invisible force. His hands clenched and unclenched, reaching for something that wasn't there. "No. Hannah." His voice broke on the name. Nancy's heart tightened. She crossed to the bed, moving as quietly as possible, and touched his shoulder. "Richard," she said softly, her voice low but steady. His eyes snapped open, expansive and unseeing breath coming fast. He looked like he didn't recognize her for a heartbeat, as if she were just another ghost in the dream. "You're awake," she murmured. "It's over." Gradually, the tension in his body eased. He sat up, pressing the heels of his hands to his eyes, drawing in long, deliberate breaths. The silence stretched heavy with things neither of them had spoken aloud. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough. "You shouldn't be here." "You sounded like you were drowning," she replied. "I couldn't just stay away." Something flickered in his expression, an old reflex to push her back, to retreat behind that wall of composure. But perhaps the remnants of the nightmare had softened the mortar, because instead of shutting her out, he exhaled and let the truth slip free. "It's been years," he said, his voice low. "But some nights, it's like I'm there again." The crash, the glass. Her hand slipped out of mine. He stared at the moonlight on the floor. "I lost Hannah that night, and I lost the family we were supposed to have. Nancy didn't speak right away. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady on him. "I know what it's like," she said finally. "Different details. Same emptiness." He looked at her not curiously, but with something quieter, a recognition. "My husband," she said, her voice even back in Georgia. He wasn't cruel at first, but the years changed him. Words turned into fists. "I left with nothing but what I could carry. I came here to start over." They sat in the hush of the room, the city far below, each holding the pieces of their past between them, like fragile glass. "I don't talk about it," Richard admitted, as though it were a confession. "Neither do I," she replied. "But sometimes it's easier when someone understands." For the first time since she'd met him, he looked directly into her eyes, without the shield of distance. And in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken agreement that perhaps neither of them had to carry their ghosts alone. When Nancy finally stood to leave, Richard didn't stop her. But as she reached the doorway, he said her name. She turned back. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and slipped out into the corridor, her pulse unsteady. Behind her, Richard sat in the moonlit stillness, the echo of her presence lingering like warmth in a room too long cold. The days after that night took on a different rhythm. Something had shifted, subtle, yet unmistakable, like the faintest change in the current beneath still water. Richard was not suddenly warm, not suddenly open. His nature was too disciplined for that, but there was a softening at the edges. When he passed Nancy in the hallway, his gaze lingered longer. When he spoke to her, his voice carried a trace of distance. One morning, he found her in the library while the city was still pale with early light. She was dusting the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of books bound in rich leather. "Do you read any of them?" she asked, without turning, as though she had sensed him standing there. "Occasionally," he replied, moving toward the window, "but mostly they're for show. Guests expect a man in my position to own specific titles." "That's a shame," she said. "Books aren't meant to be just looked at." Something in her tone, gentle, almost teasing, made him pause. He noticed the way her hands moved with care, the way she treated each book as though it had a pulse. "Which one would you choose?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes glinting in the morning light. "For you. Something that doesn't end exactly where you think it will." It was the remark that stayed with him longer than it should have. That evening, when she finished her duties, he asked her to join him in the library. "Teach me something," he said, half a challenge, half a request. She chose an old volume of poetry and began reading aloud. Her voice filled the space, low and melodic, carrying the words as though they belonged to her. At first, Richard sat in the armchair opposite her, the picture of composed attentiveness. But slowly, he began to relax, one leg stretched out, his hands folded loosely in his lap. It became a habit. Some evenings she would read. Others they would talk about cities she had visited, about the way the air smelled in Georgia before a thunderstorm, about how he used to spend summer evenings as a boy in Connecticut. They learned the shape of each other's silences. One night, the weather turned again, the kind of sudden downpour that made the city's lights blur into streaks of gold and white. The rain battered the glass like 1,000 soft knocks. Richard stood by the window, his reflection lit faintly by the lamps watching the storm. Nancy joined him close enough that he could feel the heat of her presence. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "Miss what?" "Letting someone close enough to see you." The question landed like a stone in deep water, sending ripples through places he had thought long still. He turned to face her. She wasn't looking at him with pity, only with the quiet certainty of someone unafraid of what she might find. It was then, without calculation or warning, that he reached for her. His hand cupped the back of her neck, his thumb brushing the edge of her jaw, and he kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It was the kind of kiss born from years of restraint, breaking all at once, urgent, fierce and threaded with something more profound than desire. She met him without hesitation, her hands rising to his shoulders, grounding him even as the rest of the world seemed to fall away. When they finally parted, her breath was unsteady, her lips still close enough that he could feel their warmth. She began, but he silenced her with a look that told her he didn't regret it and didn't intend to pretend it hadn't happened. For a long moment they stood there, the storm outside wrapping the city in sound, the air between them alive with something neither of them had planned. And deep within, Richard understood that whatever this was, it had already crossed the point of no return. It was Nancy's idea to introduce him to her grandmother first, not friends, not colleagues, family. Richard agreed without hesitation, but the truth was he felt the faint pull of nerves as the town car rolled away from Manhattan and into Brooklyn. It was a clear Sunday afternoon, the streets alive with children on stoops and neighbors chatting across railings. The kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, where a smile could be currency. It was foreign to him, yet oddly disarming. Nancy guided him up the narrow steps of a red brick row house trimmed with ivy. The door opened before they knocked. Grandma Rosa Nancy said, her voice warmer, softer than he'd ever heard it. The woman who emerged was small, but carried herself with the upright bearing of someone who had lived long enough to see through all pretenses. Her eyes, a deep knowing brown, swept over Richard, once twice measuring not his tailored coat or polished shoes, but something far less tangible. So she said, voice edged with a Caribbean lilt that curled each word into something almost musical, "This man thinks he can stand beside my Nancy." Richard extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Martin." Her hand was warm, but her grip was deliberate, as if testing the strength behind his greeting. "We'll see if it's mutual," she said, stepping aside. The living room was modest, but full of life. Family photographs crowded the walls, smiling faces, graduations, babies held in proud arms. A scent of slow-cooked oxtail and herbs drifted from the kitchen. Richard realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a home where the walls told so many stories. They sat at a table set with care. Rosa ladled steaming stew into bowls, her hands steady. "So, Mr. Williams," she began, "tell me why a man with all the glass and steel in the world wants to be here eating in a kitchen like mine." Richard met her gaze unflinching, because the woman beside me matters more than glass and steel. Nancy glanced at him, a flicker of surprise, and perhaps something more passing through her eyes. Rosa's spoon paused in midair. "And if one day she cannot give you what men like you often want most," he didn't hesitate, "then I would be grateful for what she can give me." The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Rosa set her spoon down. "You know about his condition," she said to Nancy. It was not a question. Nancy's hand rested on the table. "I do." "And you still sit here?" Rosa pressed. "Yes," Nancy said. The older woman studied them both, her gaze as sharp as a blade, but not without warmth. Finally, she leaned back. "Love isn't just about the days when the sun is shining. It's about the days when the roof leaks and the power's out, and you still choose to stay in the same house. Do you understand me, Mr. Williams?" "I do," Richard replied. Rosa's expression softened. "Then eat. And don't leave hungry." The conversation lightened after that. Rosa asked about his work childhood and the places he'd traveled. Richard answered honestly without embellishment. He found himself telling her about summers spent fishing with his father, about the music his mother used to play on Sunday mornings, before everything between them had soured. Rosa listened without judgment, as if taking in the sum of him, not just the parts that fit a narrative. By the time dessert arrived, warm bread pudding with a drizzle of condensed milk. Rosa's earlier reserve had given way to something like approval. When Richard stood to leave, she retook his hand this time, with less testing and more weight. She said you protect her from the world others, and sometimes from yourself. Promise me that. I promise, he said and meant it. As they stepped out into the cool evening, Nancy walked beside him silently for half a block before she spoke. She likes you, she said finally. Richard glanced at her, catching the curve of her smile in the streetlight. How can you tell? She didn't make you do the dishes, Nancy replied, and he laughed for the first time that day. It was a rare sound for him, warm, unguarded, and as it lingered between them, he realized that meeting Rosa hadn't just been about earning her trust. It had been about seeing a glimpse of Nancy's world, the roots she'd grown from the quiet strength that held her together. It made him want to stay. The first time Richard brought Nancy to meet his mother, the air between them was already charged with unspoken tension. Margaret Williams had a way of making even the most lavish spaces feel like stages for her performance. That evening, her Fifth Avenue apartment gleamed as though every surface had been polished for an audience. Crystal vases caught the lamplight. Persian rugs whispered wealth beneath every step, and the faint scent of white lilies. Margaret's favorite hung like perfume over secrets. Richard had warned Nancy. She's particular. It was the most diplomatic word he could find for a woman who had built her identity on lineage and alliances, keeping the Williams name untarnished by anything she deemed unworthy. Margaret greeted her son with a practiced smile that faltered when her gaze slid to Nancy. "And you must be Miss Martin," she said, her tone wrapped in courtesy but sharpened by something else. Nancy met her eyes without shrinking. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Williams." Dinner was served in a dining room that could have hosted 20, though only 3 places were set. The crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the silverware had been arranged with surgical precision. Margaret asked polite questions at First Nancy's hometown, her work history, but her eyes held the same calculating glint Richard had seen her use when negotiating with politicians and CEOs. Halfway through the meal, the mask slipped. "I imagine life in Atlanta must have been quite different from what you see here," Margaret said, her fork poised above her plate. "Richard's world demands a certain adaptability. Not everyone thrives in it." "I adapt well," Nancy said evenly. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so. His position comes with expectations, and discretion is paramount. The wrong kind of attention can be damaging not just to him, but to everything he's built." Richard set his wineglass down with deliberate care. "Mother," but Margaret continued her gaze, never leaving Nancy. "If it's to happen, marriage should strengthen the family's foundation, not expose it. There are alliances to consider, reputations to uphold." Nancy's posture remained steady, her voice calm. "Respect is mutual, Mrs. Williams. I know what I bring to a relationship, and I don't need to be someone else to fit into a place." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Richard broke it. "Enough. This isn't a business merger, Mother, and you haven't gotten a vote in my life." Margaret's eyes hardened. "I'm only trying to protect you, Richard. You've already survived one scandal. You can't afford another." He said this isn't about scandal, his voice low but unyielding. "It's about control, and I won't let you use it to dictate who I love." The words hung between them, final and absolute. The rest of the meal passed in brittle civility, the conversation reduced to neutral topics and long silences. When they left, Margaret kissed her son's cheek but did not look at Nancy. The city lights flickered across Richard's face in the car, casting it in alternating gold and shadow. His jaw was tight, his hands still clenched from the confrontation. "You didn't have to defend me," Nancy said quietly. "Yes, I did. He replied without hesitation. "You're not a threat to my life, Nancy. You're the only thing that makes it worth something." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Outside, the city moved on, unaware, uncaring. While inside the car, a silent vow had taken root. Margaret Williams might have declared her private war, but Richard had chosen his side, and this was a battle he had no intention of losing. It began on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day when the city's skyline seemed to blur into the clouds. Richard had just finished a conference call in his midtown office when the glass doors burst open. It wasn't Magnolia or a panicked assistant. It was 4 men and 2 women in dark suits, their badges flashing gold under the fluorescent lights. "Richard Williams," the lead agent asked, his tone leaving no room for pretense. "Yes," Richard replied, already rising from his chair. His instinct was to demand an explanation, but the sharp glint in the agent's eyes told him this was not the place for questions. "You're under federal investigation. Step away from the desk." The room stilled. Even the ever-present hum of the city outside seemed to fade. Magnolia stood frozen near the doorway, her face pale, her phone clutched. They moved quickly, 2 agents securing the office, others rifling through drawers, disconnecting hard drives, photographing documents. Another read aloud the charges: money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Each word felt like a nail driven into the quiet composure Richard had worn all his life. They claimed to have extensive evidence, offshore accounts in his name, forged signatures matching his handwriting, voice recordings, authorizing illicit transfers. None of it was real, but it would look airtight to anyone outside this office. The media were already there when they escorted him out of the building. Camera flashes exploded like gunfire voices, calling his name, shouting questions about millions funneled through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. His name was already being dragged across news tickers, his reputation dismantled in real time. Nancy was waiting at the penthouse when Magnolia called her. She arrived at the federal holding facility only to be stopped by a wall of agents. They wouldn't let her in, wouldn't even confirm if he was inside. But she saw enough in the chaos outside the cameras, the reporters, the way strangers muttered his name like a cautionary tale, to understand that whatever had happened was designed to eradicate him. Inside, Richard sat in a cold, windowless interrogation room. His lawyer, Thomas Graham, slid a file across the table. "It's bad," Thomas said bluntly. "The paper trail is clean, too clean. Whoever did this had access to your financial systems and every password you've ever used." Richard leaned back, eyes narrowing. "This isn't just about money." Thomas studied him for a beat. "No, it's personal." Richard thought of his mother's disapproving gaze and the circles she moved in old money political power, the kind of influence that didn't just open doors, it locked them against outsiders. He thought of Evelyn Peyton, the socialite his mother had once wanted him to marry. And then he thought of Evelyn's father, Senator William Peyton, known for smiling in photographs while crushing enemies behind the scenes. Pieces began to fall into place. The charges weren't meant to hold up in the long term. They were meant to strip him bare in the public eye, make him radioactive in business, and scare Nancy away before anything permanent could bind them together. When Thomas left to file motions, Richard stared at the table, his thoughts circling one truth. This was a war, and someone had just fired the first shot. That evening, Nancy managed to get a call through to him. His voice was steady, almost too steady. "You have to leave the penthouse," he told her. "I'm not Nancy. Listen to me. They'll come for you next. Your visa status, job, and name will be dragged through the mud. I can't protect you from inside a cell." Her grip on the phone tightened. "You're asking me to run. I'm asking you to survive." The line went silent momentarily, the unspoken words pressing between them. Then she said, "I'm not going anywhere." Before he could answer, the call cut off. Outside those gray walls, the city continued as if nothing had changed. But for Richard and Nancy, the storm had already broken, and it was only going to get worse. The FBI released Richard 3 days later pending further investigation. No charges had been formally filed yet, but the damage was already spreading through the veins of his life. Overnight contracts were postponed, board members were unavailable, and his name had become a headline soaked in suspicion. Nancy was there when he returned to the penthouse. He looked different, not in his suit or posture, but in how the air seemed heavier. She noticed the faint bruise on his cheekbone, which could only have come from a night spent where civility was an afterthought. He said, "You didn't have to wait here," setting down the duffel Magnolia had sent for him. "I did," she replied. For a while they didn't talk. The hum of the heating system filled the silence. Outside, Manhattan's skyline gleamed with indifference. Finally, Richard broke it. "It's Peyton." She frowned. "Evelyn's family." "Yes. Her father has the reach, the money, and the appetite for this kind of precision. He's been circling since I refused the merger deal, and since you." His gaze met hers. "He doesn't think you belong in my life, so he's going to dismantle it until you disappear." Nancy leaned back in the armchair, her hands folded. "Then we prove him wrong." A muscle worked in his jaw. "It's not that simple. This isn't a boardroom fight. He doesn't just play to win, he plays to annihilate. And he doesn't mind dragging you into the wreckage." She didn't flinch. "I've lived through worse." That night, sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Richard stayed in his study, the blue light of his laptop casting shadows across his face as he scrolled through old emails, financial ledgers, security logs, hunting for the seam in the web that had been spun around him. Nancy drifted into the library, curling up on the leather sofa with a blanket, though she knew she wouldn't sleep either. It was well past midnight when Magnolia appeared in the doorway, her face pale, a folded envelope in her hand. "This came," she whispered. Richard took it. No return address. His name was written in ink so dark it bled slightly into the paper. Inside was a single photograph, grainy but unmistakable. Leaving the penthouse 2 days ago, Nancy was unaware of the camera following her. On the back, 2 words were scrawled: "Walk away." Richard's grip tightened until the edge of the photo bent. He found Nancy in the library. She didn't ask how he'd gotten the envelope. She only studied his expression and knew it wasn't good. "They're watching you," he said quietly. "And this is just the warning shot." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then let them watch." "I'm not leaving." "You don't understand." "I do," she cut in. "They want fear to make me run, but I'm not giving them that satisfaction." The silence between them was thick, layered with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Richard stepped closer, his voice low. "If anything happens to you—" "It won't," she said, though the flicker in her eyes betrayed the truth she knew it could. He wanted to tell her he would burn down the world before letting harm touch her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering longer than necessary, as though committing the texture of her skin to memory. The city became a quieter, more dangerous place in the following days. Strange cars idled a little too long outside the building. Faces in the crowd seemed to turn toward them 1 second too late. And every night, long after the lights in the penthouse had dimmed, Richard would stand at the window staring into the dark streets below his reflection, a pale ghost in the glass. Because he knew this wasn't over. Peyton wasn't sending warnings for sport, he was laying a trap. And somewhere in those shadows the next move was already being prepared. The photograph wouldn't leave Nancy's mind. Not the grainy image itself, but the fact that someone had been close enough to take it to track her movements without her noticing. 2 days later, Richard's investigator, Alan Pierce, a wiry man, arrived at the penthouse. He moved with the restless precision of someone who had spent too many years in surveillance. He placed a thin file on Richard's desk, and with a glance toward Nancy began. "Your instincts were right," Alan said. "It's Peyton's network. But the man tailing Miss Martin wasn't one of his usual contractors. This one's personal." He spread photographs across the desk, different angles of the same man. Early 40s, lean with a face that could blend into a crowd and disappear before you realized you'd seen it. "Who is he?" Richard asked. "Marcus Kane, former private security. He did off-the-record work for the Peytons a few years back. Since then, he's been the kind of ghost people pay to keep their hands clean." Alan tapped the original photo. "He's been outside this building at least 3 nights this week." Nancy's gaze lingered on the images. There was nothing remarkable about Kane's appearance, and maybe that unsettled her most, how ordinary danger could look before it moved. Richard's voice was even, but edged with steel. "I want him gone, whatever it takes." Alan hesitated. Pushing too soon could make Peyton accelerate. "My advice, watch him. Make him think you're not aware. People like Kane slip when they think they've won." Nancy didn't like it. The idea of being watched, studied, and cataloged like a vulnerability in Richard's armor made her skin crawl. But she said nothing, because she could see the calculation behind Richard's eyes. That night she found him in the kitchen, staring into a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "You've been quiet," she said. "I'm thinking." "About Kane. About all of it." He set the glass down. "This isn't just about destroying me in business. Peyton's using you as the lever. He thinks I'll break if you're in danger." She stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "Will you?" Richard's eyes found hers sharp and unwavering. "No, but I'll burn everything between us to keep you safe if I have to." The words landed between them like a cold wind. Nancy understood the truth in them. He would end whatever they had if he believed it was the only way to shield her. And though she wanted to argue to tell him that her choice mattered too, she didn't, because some part of her feared he might be right. 2 days later, she saw Kane for the first time. She was returning from the market, her breath misting in the crisp air, when she caught the faint reflection of someone moving in sync with her on the opposite side of the street. He never looked directly at her, but she felt it awareness radiating from him like static. She forced herself not to speed up, not to let her body betray the sudden thrum of her pulse. At the building's entrance, she swiped her keycard, stepped inside, and kept her gaze fixed forward. But in the mirrored elevator doors, she saw him pause across the street, his figure blurred in the glass. When she told Richard, he listened without interrupting. Then he picked up his phone and called Alan. "Change of plan," he said. "I want him cornered." That night, the city seemed heavier. Rain slicked the streets, pooling in the cracks of the pavement, and the air held that electric charge that comes before a storm. Nancy found Richard in the study, the curtains drawn, the lights low. "We'll end this," he told her. "But when we do, you must trust me. Every step, no questions." She studied him, the hard line of his jaw, the controlled force in his voice. "I trust you," she said. But as the storm gathered outside, she wondered if trust would be enough when the trap finally closed. The storm broke just after nightfall, the relentless rain that blurred the city into a smear of silver and shadow. Nancy saw the drops from the penthouse racing down the glass, distorting the skyline into shifting shapes. Marcus Kane was moving somewhere in the city's undercurrent, and tonight Richard intended to force him into the open. Alan's plan was simple in its outline, but dangerous in execution. He lured Kane into following Nancy. Then, he cornered him in a location where there would be no crowd, no escape routes, and no witnesses, except those Richard trusted. Nancy agreed, though not without hesitation. The thought of being bait was a cold knot in her stomach, but she knew there was no other way to end the watching the silent pressure that had crept into her life like a shadow under the door. At 9 o'clock sharp, she left the building dressed in jeans, a dark coat, and no jewelry. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement, the streetlights hazy in the mist. She walked without hurry. Her steps measured her head down just enough to look unaware. But she could feel him. The presence lingered behind her, never too close, never far. It was like being tracked by a ripple in still water, impossible to see, undeniable to feel. She turned down a side street in Chelsea, where the glow of storefronts gave way to darker facades and shuttered windows. Alan was somewhere nearby, his voice crackling faintly in Richard's earpiece from the surveillance van. He's on her, 40 feet back, moving steadily. Hidden in the black sedan, parked 2 blocks ahead, Richard felt his pulse tighten with every update. He wasn't built for this, waiting, watching someone he loved walk straight into a predator's sightline. Nancy reached the alley behind a closed cafe, its single street lamp flickering. She stopped to adjust her scarf, the movement deliberate. Behind her, footsteps slowed. Then the air shifted. Kane stepped onto the edge of the light. He didn't speak, didn't smile. Just stood there, his gaze steady, head tilted slightly, as if committing every detail of her face to memory. Nancy said, "You've been following me." Her voice calm, despite the hammering in her chest. "Not following," he replied. His voice was low, almost conversational. "Watching. There's a difference." "What do you want?" A faint smile ghosted across his face. "To see if you're smart enough to leave before it gets worse." Before she could answer, shadows moved at the mouth of the alley. Alan and another man stepped forward, blocking the exit. Richard was only seconds behind his coat, dark with rain, his eyes fixed on Kane with a focus that felt like a blade drawn in silence. "Kane," Richard said evenly, "we can do this 2 ways quietly, or the way that ends with you in a hospital." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Rain pattered against the brick walls, dripping from the fire escape above. Kane's gaze slid from Richard to Nancy, and something passed between them in that glance, a silent acknowledgement that this was no longer about intimidation. It was about survival. "You're making a mistake," Kane said finally. "You think you understand who's pulling the strings, but you don't." "Try me," Richard said. Kane's smile returned sharper this time. "You're looking at Peyton. You should be looking at someone closer." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Richard's mind. But before he could press, Kane stepped backward toward the far end of the alley. Alan moved to block him, but Kane quickly slipped into the rain-slicked darkness and vanished into the side street's maze. Richard swore under his breath, turning to Alan. "Find him. Now." Nancy's voice broke the tension. What did he mean? Someone closer. Richard looked at her, rain sliding down his jaw, and for the first time since this began, something in his eyes unsettled her more than the threat outside. Doubt. If Kane were telling the truth, the real danger wouldn't be waiting in the shadows. It would already be inside their walls. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried the damp chill of a city wrung out overnight. From the penthouse windows, the streets gleamed under a washed-out sky, deceptively calm. Inside, however, Richard felt anything but. Kane's final words looped in his mind with surgical precision. "You should be looking at someone closer." Magnolia was the first to notice his distraction. She found him in the study, staring at a file he hadn't turned a page in for over an hour. "You didn't sleep," she said, more observation than question. He didn't look up. "Did you notice anything off in the last few weeks? Anyone acting differently?" Her brow furrowed. You mean besides the FBI tearing apart your office, closer than that? His voice was quiet, but a hard undertone made her still. Someone who has access. Someone who could have handed Peyton everything he needed. Magnolia's gaze sharpened. You think there's a leak here? Kane's not the kind of man to bluff. Nancy walked in mid-conversation, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. A leak where Richard glanced at her, weighing the wisdom of sharing his suspicions, but chose honesty in my circle. Someone is feeding Peyton information, and Kane has confirmed it. Her expression didn't waver, but she set the mugs down slowly. You have people in and out of this place all the time. Staff, business contacts, friends. Friends, he repeated, almost as if the word itself had become suspect. The following 48 hours became an exercise in quiet paranoia. Richard reviewed his inner circle name by name, examining every possible motive. Alan combed through call logs, security footage, encrypted messages, looking for that single thread that could unravel the sabotage. Nancy felt the tension in the air grow heavier with each passing hour. She noticed how Richard's gaze would linger on people a moment too long, as though trying to read the truth from how they carried themselves. Even with her, there was a new distance. Not coldness, but a carefulness, like he was afraid of what might be revealed if he looked too closely. The break came unexpectedly. Alan called just before midnight, his voice taut. I've got something. The breach in your Cayman account didn't come from an outside server. It came from a private network registered to an apartment on East 71st Street. Richard's breath stilled. Whose apartment? There was a pause. Magnolia's. When Richard turned, Magnolia was standing in the doorway. She'd heard every word. I can explain, she said, her voice steadier than he expected. Nancy stood from the sofa, her eyes narrowing. Explain how your network ended up being used to ruin him. Magnolia's jaw tightened. Because someone planted it there. I didn't touch his accounts. But a week before the FBI showed up, a tech team Peyton hired came by to upgrade my system. I thought it was for security. She looked at Richard. They used me as the doorway. Alan's voice cut through the speaker. She's not lying. I checked her logs, and unauthorized access was masked under the upgrades. Smart move, using someone close enough to bypass suspicion. Richard exhaled tension, unspooling, but not disappearing. If Magnolia was telling the truth, and the data supported it, then Kane's warning was still valid. Someone closer than Peyton's network was in play, but it wasn't her. Richard and Nancy stood by the window that night, the city stretching silent and indifferent beyond the glass. Do you believe her? Nancy asked. I have to. Richard said, though the weight in his voice betrayed that belief was fragile. But this means whoever's inside, they're better hidden than I thought. Nancy rested her hand lightly against his arm. Then we find them. Together. For the first time since Kane had slipped into the rain, Richard allowed himself to look at her thoroughly, not as a liability in someone's game, but as the only constant he could trust when the walls kept shifting. Still deep inside, he knew the truth. No matter how strong glass will shatter, if the correct pressure is applied. And somewhere out there, someone had already found the fault line. The first sign came in the smallest of ways. A text to Richard's private phone, one that only a handful of people knew existed. It was a photo taken somewhere high above the city. Standing on a corner near Bryant Park. Nancy Had's coat pulled tight against the wind. The angle was distant, the lighting dim, but her face was unmistakable. Beneath it, a message. You can't protect her forever. Richard didn't forward it to Alan. He didn't mention it to Magnolia. Instead, he drove straight to where Nancy was, her community center in Harlem, waiting in his car until she stepped out. The moment she saw him, she frowned. You're early. He held up the phone. This was sent an hour ago. Her eyes flickered over the image. But she didn't flinch. They're still trying to scare us. It's working, he admitted. His voice was low, deliberate, like a man who'd spent his life controlling the terms of every battle and was now fighting one where the rules kept changing. They rode back to the penthouse in silence, the air between them tight with what neither said aloud. Alan was waiting when they stepped inside, and a laptop was open on the counter. I traced the sender's IP. It's bouncing through half a dozen proxies, but the source. He turned the screen toward Richard, your mother's estate in Greenwich. The words hung in this room like a shard of glass. Nancy glanced at Richard, expecting him to deny it outright. Instead, he sat down, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It's not her. She doesn't have the skill, and she wouldn't get her hands dirty. But she knows people who do. And Peyton's one of them, Nancy said quietly. Maybe, Richard replied. Or perhaps she's decided to take matters into her own hands. Alan closed the laptop. Either way, this is the closest we've come to an origin point. If you want to end this, we'll go there. Tonight. The drive to Greenwich felt like moving through a tunnel, miles passing without notice, the road narrowing to a single inevitability. The estate loomed out of the darkness, its windows glowing faintly against the manicured grounds. Margaret was in the drawing room, her expression a blend of surprise and mild annoyance. Richard, Nancy, to what do I owe this? Late visit. Richard didn't waste time. Someone's been feeding Peyton information from your estate. Don't bother denying it, we traced the signal. Her lips tightened. And you assume I'm the culprit. I assume you've decided you know what's best for me, like always. Margaret's gaze slid to Nancy, her tone softening into something almost maternal, but edged. I only want my son to be safe. And you, she shook her head faintly. You've put him in more danger than you realize. Nancy didn't look away. The danger isn't me. It's whoever's trying to erase him. For a moment, the air between the three of them felt like a fault line ready to split. Then Margaret sighed, a slight weary sound. You're both being played. By Peyton. By people in your own company. And yes, by someone here. But it isn't me. She turned toward the door, calling for her butler. When the man entered, she looked at him with an expression that made Richard's skin crawl. Robert, she said, it's time. The man froze, then slowly set down his silver tray. Richard could see it in his eyes, the flicker of someone cornered. Alan stepped in from the hallway, hand brushing the inside of his coat where the pistol sat. We should talk outside, he told Robert. It was over in minutes. The butler, trusted for over 15 years, admitted to taking payments from Peyton's office to plant monitoring devices in Margaret's home and passing along details about Richard's movements. By the time they left, the night felt different. Not lighter, because this was only one layer of a deeper scheme, but clearer. In the car, Nancy reached for his hand. We're closer. Richard looked at her, the city lights beginning to glow on the horizon. Closer means the strikes will get sharper. Then we hold tighter, she said. Her fingers threaded through his, and for a moment it felt like the world outside couldn't touch them. Stay with us if you've been following this journey through the storms, the betrayals, the moments where trust felt like the most fragile thing in the world. There's more ahead, and I promise the next turn will change everything. Like, comment, and follow to avoid missing what comes next. Because the truth, we're only now stepping into the deepest part of the fire.